Okay, good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator with Purdue Extension. I'm based in Clay and Owen counties. For those of you who don't know, those are the two counties that are right between Terre Haute and Bloomington. The main towns there are Brazil, Indiana, and Spencer, Indiana. The reasons I'm telling you this is because in between those two counties, I've had the opportunity to observe and deal with quite a few invasive species. Tonight's topics are going to cover autumn olive and a couple other invasive trees, though arguably autumn olive can be a shrub as well. This is definitely a tree that I have had to see on a lot of people's property, and it always disappoints me when I see it because it is such a challenging thing to get rid of. So let's go ahead and dive in here. Now, one thing that I have not yet talked about, I've only briefly mentioned, is the terrestrial plant rule that went into effect in 2019. So this is a rule that covers approximately 44, 45 species of invasive plants, and it prohibits their sale, exchange, gifting, any kind of distribution or transport of any of these plants. Now, after Governor Holcomb signed the bill for the terrestrial plant law, businesses were still able to sell them for a certain period of time so that way they could empty their inventories, though I would have certainly preferred that they not be able to sell them at all. And after that point in 2020, now it is completely prohibited for that list of 44 to 45 plants. You can easily look up that list. It's in government code. It's also on several invasive species management websites, and I imagine SICM also keeps track of that as well. The reason I bring this up is because more obviously needs to be done. There are a lot of plants that still got sold during that period of time for about a year as businesses were transitioning, and there are a lot of invasive species that could still be sold right now that were not covered by that rule. This means that we need to be very attentive to what we're purchasing. We need to make sure we double check everything. I'm getting in the habit now that if I'm looking at a plant, I automatically just pull out my phone. I have the Google Lens app on my phone, and I will use that app to look up anything I'm looking at. It's very handy, and it will take me to a Wikipedia page or an extension publication so I know what I'm working with. And I highly recommend all of you, if you have a smartphone, to do that same thing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about autumn olive. This isn't going to be a long one, but it is an important one because autumn olive can be extraordinarily challenging. And one thing that I want to ask is that if we have anyone from like SICM or anybody who's a part of a SISMA who's worked with this, please feel free to post your experiences in the chat because it really will help us out. Autumn olive is a tree that is prohibited by the terrestrial plant rule. It's an extremely fast growing invader, and the seeds are quickly dispersed by birds. They will be carried in the fruit that you saw in that first image here, right here. The birds will eat them and just spread them everywhere. There are entire properties I've seen that are covered in autumn olive, and unfortunately, it is encroaching into our state parks. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that later. It is a heavily shading tree. It will shade out everything around it, and it can have a really, really negative impact on the ability of other species to propagate around it because of their ability to fix nitrogen even in the poorest of soils. Now, what you're looking at right here is actually a video that's loading. This is a drone video that I took when I was working with McCormick's Creek State Park. And what they asked me to do was to map out some of the invasive species they have. Now, this is in the northern portion of the park. It is an old pasture that they are trying to convert back to a natural state. And what you're seeing here is the smaller green plants towards the bottom of the forest understory there. Those are autumn olive. And we were tracking how far they had spread throughout this area. And there's only about a minute or so of video here, but I took approximately 5 minutes of it. And I'm using a drone, which means I covered a lot of area. And there were very few locations that I did not readily see autumn olive. So it had spread very, very heavily. The park is working very hard to eradicate this plant out. But unfortunately, if you've ever worked with autumn olive, you know that that is nigh on impossible. They have very strong root systems. They are extremely resilient and can develop in really poor soils. So they're kind of the ideal invader. Now, like I've been saying this whole time, autumn olive thrives in disturbed and edge habitats. So let me go back to that video for a moment here. You could see that where I was identifying the autumn olive, where those green spots are along this path that they've carved out. That is an edge habitat. That means that is an ideal location for this plant to develop. Right where that interface is between two habitats, that seems to be the spot where most invasive species are really able to dominate. And this tree is certainly no exception. Now, another thing that makes them very, very capable invaders is their ability to survive in extremely nutrient poor soils because they have particular organs or root nodules that are able to fix nitrogen very, very readily, which means that they can survive in some of the worst environments you can imagine. And unfortunately, they're just able to push out anything else that might struggle to get a foothold. So if you have an area that, say, was recently hit by some kind of major disturbance, autumn olive is going to be able to take advantage of that very, very easily. And then as succession begins to kick back in, it just spreads all over and pushes out anything else that could take root. Now it's essentially spread across most of the eastern United States. And of course, like many of the invaders that we've talked about, this plant was intentionally brought here as rootstock, thinking that we could actually make more use out of it. So let's go through a little bit of the identification of this. Now, the good thing is that autumn olive is fairly easy to identify. So, but I want to give you all the tools you're going to need to make sure that you can identify it. The leaves are perhaps one of the easiest ways that you can use to make sure of what plant you're looking at. These are pinnately compound leaves, meaning that what you're looking at right in that last image right here, that is a set of leaflets. And the actual twig that they're attached to is the leaf itself. That's what that pinnate is going to mean. They're going to appear as a twig with several leaflets, and those pinnate leaves are going to be alternate on the actual branch that they're springing from. The upper leaf surface is going to be a very dark green, and it's going to look a little bit waxy. And the underside of those leaves is going to have a silvery appearance. That's what I use to guarantee that I'm working with autumn olive, because the shape of those leaves, that wavy, smooth edge that they have, those are a dead giveaway, especially when you see that silver color created by scales on the underside of the leaves. Flowers are going to be these trumpet-like flowers that you see right here. So they're going to be small, white to yellow in color, and they're only going to be composed of 4 petals. These flowers are going to be fairly small, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in length, and they're going to bloom in clusters of 4 to 6 flowers. So you should be able to readily see them once they start blooming, because most of the time when we think of white flowers, we may be thinking of calorie pear, which I'm going to discuss here in a little bit, but they should bloom at different times if I know my timing right. Now, the fruit is another way that you can identify autumn olive. And I've actually had several people come into my office with a twig or a branch of autumn olive with the fruit on it, wanting to know what they were looking at because they wanted to know if they could use them as food. Now, I can't comment on their nutritional value. The only thing I can say is just please don't grow this plant for its food. It will not help you out. They're going to grow just like the flowers in clusters of 4 to 6. They're going to be orange to red in color, and there can be a lot of variation in there. And they're going to have small flecks of silver, just like that silvery sheen that you see on the bottom side of the leaf. As they last on the twig itself, they're going to turn into a brownish color as they essentially ripen. And then they contain a single seed. So the birds are going to see those fruit, they're going to see them get ripe, and they're going to go ahead and eat them. To my knowledge, the fruit do not pose any kind of danger to wildlife, but unfortunately, the wildlife will just spread the seeds, and that's how autumn olive is able to propagate so easily. Now let's go over a few management options for autumn olive. This is where things get a little bit hairy. So I actually did quite a bit of research before I got here this evening because I was trying to look up more management options to talk about. And every single publication, and even my conversations with other educators and people work in the area, They all agree that the best recommendation to start with is you've got to triage it. You've got to pick the areas that have the highest chance of recovery, because the areas that are poor, you're going to just be expending so much energy and time into, it's not going to be worth it. Early removal is always going to be your best bet, just like with any invasive. But the trouble is, the roots of autumn olive are strong. They can propagate from the root. And if you don't eliminate all of them, next year, you're just going to be revisiting that problem. And if you are considering using any kind of mowing or bush hogging to eliminate these trees, you must follow it up with some kind of herbicidal treatment, because they will simply come right back. Guaranteed. They are that tough to kill. Now, we've seen this before. I've shown you all of you this at previous sessions of this program. For those of you who haven't seen it before, this is a calendar of treatment that was created by the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management Organization. This, I believe, was made in 2019. Yeah, it says March 2019 on there. Back when their name was Southern Indiana Cooperative Management, Invasive Management. Since then, they changed the name. However, this document, I think, is absolutely terrific. This is one of the best resources I've ever seen when it comes to figuring out the proper timing for managing foliar or cut stump treatments or any number of pesticide applications when it comes to our invasive species. Now, you see here that they've added autumn olive under their shrub category, which has been where our bush honeysuckle and multiflora rose that we've previously talked about is also. So what we're looking at now is that we want to do foliar treatments between May and September, basically when most of the growth of the leaves is already done. Cut surface treatments, which are going to be fairly effective with autumn olive, are going to be best between June and March. So that way you can have time to be able to get to the plants when they're dormant or when they're still green in the fall and everything else is dormant. That way you can only damage autumn olive and not risk anything else. The basal bark treatment here being recommended is also effective, but it can be difficult on multiple stemmed shrubs. And you also have to be sure that you can get to them, which can be a challenge depending on what you're working with. Now you can see here, if you look at the color of each of these on their little calendar, so the foliar spray is orange, and they have it color coded towards the bottom, foliar spray with 3% glyphosate or 1 to 4% non-ionic surfactant. And that is what is recommended for the treatment of that. And it remains true across just about every piece of research that I've been able to find in the last day or two. Basal bark treatments are generally done with triclopyr and horticultural oil. And then your cut surface treatment, you're looking at 50% glyphosate and 50% water to treat these. As always, please, when you use pesticides on these plants, follow the label directions as much as you can, and that the label is the law on that. And also, please make sure to watch for any issues with drifting the pesticide away from its target. You don't want to accidentally kill the plants you're trying to save. So I kind of went through that already. So that was autumn olive. So a lot of our trees, there's really not a whole lot to say there. So what I want to do is I want to cover a couple more trees while we have the time. One of the ones that bugs me like you wouldn't believe is calorie pear. Calorie pear was not added to the terrestrial plant rule, unfortunately, and it is a favorite ornamental that a lot of people love to plant. This constantly mystifies me. So calorie pear is also known as Bradford pear, and you can see why it's planted as an ornamental because it creates all those pretty white flowers and it greens up really nice and early. However, if you smell the flowers, you are in for a bad time because they produce a terrible odor and they create small hard pears that really aren't anything that you want to eat. This plant was originally introduced as rootstock for pear development, thinking that we would be able to get something out of it. And unfortunately, the only thing we get out of it is a tree that very readily spreads across the landscape. So I live in Terre Haute, Indiana. There are calorie pears all over the place down here. And the trouble is they're now traveling well beyond those neighborhoods. If I drive on any of the highways outside of town, I will see these trees blooming. They're spreading everywhere. They're going in all the cardinal directions. And it just blows my mind that people keep wanting to plant these. I wish they had been added to that prohibited plant list. So let's make sure we can identify calorie pear, though I don't think this is going to be a real challenge. Leaves are alternately arranged on this plant, and they're going to be rounded or even have a teardrop shape. They're also going to be fairly thick and waxy. Now, unlike our autumn olive, the leaves of calorie pear are going to be toothed, and it's going to have a ripple in its surface. So let's go back to that previous image. If you look close, you can see that, yeah, there are very, very tiny little teeth in there on the edge of the leaves, on their margins. And there's that wavy appearance that they will all have. That is not a disease sign. That is actually just the way the leaves are shaped with this plant. Now let's identify the flowers a little bit, though I think this one's pretty easy. So they're going to have white 5-petals flowers that they're going to form in a ball-shaped cluster. This is what really attracts people to the plant because those clusters are really nice to look at. The flowers are going to be about 3/4 of an inch across with very obvious anthers sticking out. For those of you who don't know, the little things sticking out of the flower with the red on them, those are the anthers. Those are the male parts of the flower where the pollen is coming from. So they kind of add to the display of this plant. The flowers, unfortunately, will produce an unpleasant odor that some people compare to the smell of fish, honestly. And it is nasty. You don't want to smell these. So I'm always confused why people think this is a great plant to put in the ground, because if it's really humid outside and these plants are going into their fragrant phase, it can smell awful. So yeah, make of that what you will. So let's talk a little bit about our management options with calorie pear. Now, this is the trouble. This tree is not a prohibited tree. So treating it can be a challenge because technically it's not considered a pest. Now, control timing roughly matches the same as our autumn olive and shrub plants. You may need to do foliar applications multiple times in a season to try to eliminate the new growth. So you're looking at something like applying glyphosate to it at 50%. Basal bark and cut surface treatments are also viable and they follow similar timing. Now, the trouble is that that's really all the information that exists on this one because, like I said, it's still considered an ornamental plant. So they may not fall under pesticide rules as per normal. Obviously, these are invasive plants. We don't want them to stick around. So please remove them, treat them, and get rid of them so that way some of our natives can take over. If you're wondering what you could put in a spot with calorie pear, there are lots of really pretty maples that I love. There are plenty of oaks and a whole lot of other things you can put there. All right, so the last plant that I'm going to talk about this evening is Tree of Heaven. This is one I get a lot of complaints about. This is a nightmare that has been haunting us for a couple hundred years now, actually. Even though this plant has been here since the 18th century, I still consider it an invasive species. It is not naturalized, it is an invader. So this was introduced as a shade-producing ornamental in the 18th century. People thought it was going to be a great option because it could tolerate poor soils, it provides lots of shade, it's pretty, and that's a great thing. Well, unfortunately, even back then, they recognized very quickly that this thing was more weedy than they liked, and it spread westward from the East Coast very, very quickly. Blessedly, it's easy to identify. So the leaves here, this is a great image of the leaves. I love this because it was such a clear image I was able to find. It is a pinnately compound leaf. So that means that right here, we are looking at leaflets on what appears to be a twig. That is actually the whole leaf with its leaflets. The leaflets themselves are going to have an opposite arrangement and be lance shaped. That really makes them very easy to identify. And then you could see that at the end of the leaflet, the leaves begin to take on that reddish hue. And that's very common with Tree of Heaven. Another way that you can also identify it is at the base of each leaflet, there's a glandular nodule that if you crush it, it releases a really foul odor. So if you're removing Tree of Heaven and you've noticed that smell, that is where that smell is coming from. Unfortunately, there's just no way to stop that one. So some other features that this plant has, it has a mottled bark that as the plant matures, the skin texture is going to become very similar to that of a cantaloupe. And to me, that's one of the things that really marks it out as an invader, as a plant that's not native to here, because a lot of our trees don't have that kind of bark pattern to them. Usually they either have a smoother appearance or they have a much more creviced appearance to them, like an ash tree. They usually don't do a kind of cantaloupe or a pebbled skin appearance. They're going to have winged seeds, just like a maple does. These are referred to as samara. So they're going to have little helicopters, as some kids I saw today when I was teaching them mentioned. And the twigs are going to have a noticeable heart-shaped leaf scar. So that is an easy way to look at them and tell what plant you're looking at. Look for where you can find the nodes on the twigs. And if you see that heart-shaped leaf scar, that's a dead giveaway. You can also slice open the twigs or cut them in half. Tree of Heaven is going to have a really thick, spongy brown pith to it that's going to fill just about the entirety of the twig itself. That's definitely a little unusual amongst trees. Most of our trees don't have a pith that is that large by comparison. So that's also going to be a dead giveaway for a Tree of Heaven. Now, some management options for this. This is another plant where if it grows directly from the roots. So we don't recommend that you cut this plant at all because it will just spring back so quickly. If you do have to cut it though, and oftentimes you will need to, treat it with an herbicide first. So that way you can intentionally damage and weaken this plant. And then once the symptoms of, say, your glyphosate or your triclopyr begin to appear on the plant, then go ahead and cut it, because that means you're reducing the plant's ability to grow back and you're reducing its chance of survival. You can hand pull seedlings, like with a lot of invasive species. However, you want to make sure you do it when the soil is moist, and you can remove the entire root system that way. If you do it when the soil is dry, especially when it's compact, you're going to pull the plant out, but you're going to tear off half the roots, and then they'll just regrow from the roots. And instead of one Tree of Heaven, you're going to have multiple Tree of Heaven then. So please keep that in mind. Now, there are some treatment options listed on that same document from Sikkim that I was showing you earlier. I've got it highlighted down here. Now, even Sikkim points out here under Tree of Heaven, root sprouts prolifically, do not cut if possible. So that's kind of telling you something about this plant. They are flat out warning you, please do not cut this plant because of how it's going to sprout. Now, one of the recommendations they are making is foliar spray should only be on small trees, and they're recommending a 3% glyphosate product with a non-ionic surfactant. And then basal bark treatments can help reduce the sprouting. Do not treat when snow on the ground. So that means that is a concern where the treatment could potentially get into the snow and then you'll have a runoff event. The basal bark treatment that they're recommending is 20 to 30% triclopyr, which should be fairly selective, using an oil-based carrier for it. So that means that it's one of those where you can open up the bark, walk away, and then come back and do your basal bark treatment. Beyond that, there are unfortunately not many options for Tree of Heaven, which is why it is so nasty. The best thing I can tell you is identify it early and remove it early. If you have a much older Tree of Heaven that you're working with, then you're probably looking at multiple basal bark treatments over time, and just avoid cutting those roots as much as possible. You are probably looking at the need for equipment too to remove the entire plant. So some kind of backhoe or something like that to make sure you can get everything out, because otherwise you're just going to be revisiting this problem next year. All right, so that is actually what I had for you. There is only so much out there on invasive trees. So I'm showing you the picture of the baby goat again. Unfortunately, goats are not going to be great for trees. They're not going to be able to reach much in the way of branches unless they're very, very young. So you're probably looking at the use of goats for something like bush honeysuckle or other things. So unfortunately, there are some limitations on what we can do there. And there is a lot of research still ongoing into many of our herbicides to see if we can improve them. But the trouble is that we only have so many herbicide molecules, and they do wear out over time. So hopefully we will have more herbicidal molecules that you can use to try to get rid of these plants. So I've got my contact information up here. You can call either of my offices anytime, and I'll be happy to talk to you about your invasive plants or other things. And I've got links to our Purdue Ed Store and our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Labs. For those things where you need help figuring out what's wrong, they can help you do it. So thank you all for coming this evening.